She wanted the floor to open and swallow her whole, right there beneath the fluorescent hum of the school gym, while Mr. Alvarez's voice curled through the PTA like a knife, and every pair of eyes turned to a woman who had only ever wanted to teach boys and girls to feel instead of harden. "You're ruining him with poetry," he snarled, palms stabbing the laminated agenda as if it were a prophecy. "You soft-set their minds. They need trades, not sonnets. You don't want my son going to art school. You want him to waste his future on feelings." Elena's face burned with a heat that had nothing to do with the late April humidity. Shame, yes, but a deeper, keening fear that this town where every reputation was currency would decide she was expendable. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. He had watched her from the rain-slicked sidewalk across the street, coat collar high against drizzle, breath fogging the air as if he were having time to spare for such things. Watching became a habit for Matteo Vercelli. Watching the geometry of a city, the way a wave of shame folded a person in on herself, the exact angle at which a man could make a crowd turn and judge. He had seen teachers before. He had seen reputations tarnished and businesses ground to dust. But Elena's small, stubborn posture in the gym, a woman who had stood up to recalcitrant seniors over late essays, who read Neruda aloud to an entire class until the boys had laughed and then cried, made something in him tilt. It was not pity alone. It was the recognition of a courageous defiance in a soft voice, and the unbearable cruelty of a parent who mistook love for leverage. The accusation spread faster than the rain. By morning, the PTA minutes were a whispering wildfire. "She lets them cry in class. She teaches the kids to question the principles of business and profit." There were those who sided with Mr. Alvarez, the small business owners who saw real threats in boys who wanted to be painters instead of mechanics. But more than a few private messages arrived in Elena's inbox, thin as paper-thin lifelines. People who had been saved by a teacher from the brittle insistence of fate. Old students who remembered a desk lamp and a library book that had been the hinge of their own escape. Elena walked home that night under an umbrella that did not stop the tremor in her hands. Her apartment was a narrow second-floor walk-up above a laundromat, full of the smell of detergent and second chances, a clutter of class novels and chipped mugs. She lived modestly. She paid rent on time. She invested her evenings in lesson plans and in a brother, Miguel, whose laughter had once filled both their lives like sunlight. Miguel had gone quiet 5 years ago. One day he stopped answering his phone, and Elena's mother stopped setting a place for him at Sunday dinner. Words like disappeared and left town whispered through the neighborhood like rumors that shouldn't be voiced. Elena had learned to hold that ache as one holds a fragile heirloom, with the protective terror of something easily broken. At her doorstep that night was a plain cardboard box, a single red ribbon knotted with deliberate, almost ceremonial care. It should have been a bouquet, a fruit basket, a muffled apology. Instead, Elena found a dossier-like envelope propped against the box. No name, only the embossed letter V at the top, small and impeccable. Her fingers, papery with cold, trembled as she unknotted the ribbon. Inside was not cash, not a check slipped into an envelope, but a proposal written with the crisp authority of money that could not be ignored. A legally established scholarship in the name of Marquez Literary Futures, funds earmarked for the arts program, and an endowment sizable enough to fund extracurricular writing workshops for 3 years. Tucked beneath the legal language was a short handwritten note. "Forgive what my hands have broken. Keep teaching." Elena folded the paper against her chest and waited for the shape of gratitude to arrive and for the shape of dread to follow it. It came in waves. The scholarship meant security for the program, the sort of security that extended more than one semester. It also meant someone had stared at her humiliation through the rainy window and decided to answer with a currency that spoke louder than applause. The name on the letterhead, Vercelli Foundation, was a name people said with both fear and a perfunctory, necessary respect. Matteo Vercelli's name opened doors. It sorted problems. It had become a whispered shorthand for favors that were paid and favors that were withheld. The next morning, the paper that ran a city beat put a headline above a picture of Elena in her classroom, soft smile, the curve of a book in her hands. Local teacher given major gift after PTA outburst. The headline transformed the humiliation into a spectacle. Elena's colleagues were divided not by the validity of the gift, but by its source. "You can't accept that," whispered Mrs. Keegan from math, who feared association and its logistical reverberations. "He's a Vercelli. He buys gratitude where guilt should be," said Tom Alvarez's brother-in-law in the hardware store. Yet parents queued to sign permission forms for their children's participation in the new workshops, as if a donation made the world safer. The principal, fearful for the school's funding ledger, palmed the foundation's letter in a drawer and did not close it. In the days that followed, Elena learned the dangerous music of gratitude. Anonymous calls cluttered her voicemail, some thin with praise, others thick with suspicion. "If it's from Vercelli, what's he buying?" asked a former student over coffee, her eyes narrowed at Elena, tasting the future from her lips. Elena could see how the ribbon had restitched her dignity in public and frayed it in private. She stood before her class, trying to show the same calm the scholarship promised for her students, and felt as though invisible hands rearranged the air around her, the knowledge that the kindness might carry its own chain. Matteo watched the weather of the town shift from one telephone booth to another, from the server rooms his team kept humming to the public park where teenagers dared to dream aloud. He had not intended to be theatrical. He had been certain his move was simply correct. Art mattered because it kept people humane, he told himself in the quiet of his office, where the walls were maps of territories and pie charts. Yet he had not imagined that his intervention would be examined for motive like a scalpel seeking bone. Inside his world, people read acts of mercy as currency to be converted. Soft acts made enemies uneasy, and the old guards of his organization scoffed at tenderness as a liability. Word reached him through channels he curated for the fragile, whispered emails, coded playlists, an old friend who still ran a corner cafe. "She's holding herself together," she said, "but they won't stop." Matteo's hand closed around the phone until it creaked. He realized he had begun to care for something he had no right to care for. He had never meant to call attention to himself, but attention had its own gravity. He instructed his people to be discreet. No banners, no interviews, only the legal mechanics of the scholarship. Still, rumors breed in omission like mold in the dark, and rivals whose accounts had been rebuffed began to gnaw at the edges of his decision. Within 48 hours, the school's network flagged an intrusion attempt, an odd spike in traffic that tried to make the school's archival files vanish. The IT teacher, a man who taught kids to build computers out of treasure bin parts, looked at the logs and said the word at last: attacks. Elena felt a cold that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. To have given a donation was one thing. To be the center of a smear or a cyber siege was another. She had thought the scale of her life was a single classroom. Matteo's intervention had small ripples and large ones. In the same week, a rival news outlet published innuendo about the scholarship, and a local troll account promised consequences for Vercelli perks. That same night, in her narrow kitchen, Elena placed the scholarship letter atop her modest dining table and touched the embossed V as if to read its temperature. In the corner of her mind rose the image of Miguel, bent forward over a small workbench where he used to repair radios for extra money. Miguel had argued once that the world belonged to the practical, a closed fist of trades and mortgages and enough certainty to keep a body fed. Elena had argued back with a book pressed to her chest, words like seeds. Where then had he gone? The memory pushed against the fresh threat, as if harmonizing with it. Matteo could not assume his intervention would be a net good. His ledgerers, those who tallied advantage and cost, whispered about optics and vulnerability. "You put a target on a school," said an advisor whose face was often in the glow of stock charts. "You become no longer clean." Matteo understood the truth like a dull ache. Power, for all its reach, had boundaries. He had crossed one by altering a small town's resource in the name of something that smelled like mercy. He had been born into a family that measured loyalty in ledgers and bloodlines. His life required him to be efficient and cold when necessary. Yet watching Elena accept the box with hands that shook, and then stand in a classroom and hand a worn copy of Plath to a girl who looked at the cover like a revelation, understanding struck him like a live wire. That same week, Elena received an email from the principal. The board had voted to accept the scholarship, but they requested that she be present at a press conference to make a statement. She refused at first. She did not want to be used as a symbol, a woman rescued who would then be paraded. But the principal insisted gently. People need to see a face to trust the money. When the moment came, Elena found herself beneath a canopy of microphones, the ribboned box at her feet like an accusation. Cameras blinked like surveillance moths. Behind them lay the town, the hardware store, the laundromat, the corner where teenagers smoked. She felt naked in front of the lenses. Her voice, however, surprised her. When it emerged, it was steady, not because she had swallowed fear, but because, for the first time in a long while, she felt an argument worth defending. "You don't have to choose between practicality and humanity," she told the microphones. "Art is not only comfort. It's the light that teaches us to understand our own faces." The words were not declamatory. They were a teacher's answer to a question she had asked students 1,000 times. Why do we read? Her eyes found the crowd and then paused on the wet street, as if she sensed blades in the grass. She did not see the man under the coat across the street, but his gaze rested on her like a promise and a warning both. The applause after Elena's press statement was small and polite, the kind that pats a wound but doesn't probe. Cameras spun back to their producers. Editors whispered into headsets, and someone from the local paper approached with a business card and a smile that tried to be kind. Elena walked home with the weight of everyone's expectations and the secret knowledge that someone had chosen to put a target on her doorway in the interest of keeping 8-year-olds drawing and teenagers writing into the night. That night, on the edge of sleep, she imagined the men who made the town's wind blow in particular directions, men with suits like armor, voices like ledgers. She tried to ask herself what she owed, the scholarship that promised more classrooms and new books, or the clarity of her conscience that had never been for sale. She had always believed in small transactions, the patient handing down of meaning, the slow accumulation of trust. Now someone had swapped giant bills for her small faiths, and the numbers on the ledger glittered like alien stars. Matteo had intended to be invisible. He preferred to make things happen at 3 in the morning when the city's veins pulsed in quieter rhythms. Yet the press conference forced him into the light like a moth to a porch lamp. He watched the footage from his office, a narrow, sterile room lined with screams, seeing Elena move like a metronome of truth. The choice to intervene had been sudden and selfish at first. He had no child in that school, no direct tie beyond a memory of a poem read to him on a winter balcony in Palermo, a woman's voice that once taught a boy how to feel. But it had opened into something more complicated, a sense of responsibility tangled with desire, and the realization that his family's reach could shelter something beautiful if he let it. The reaction within his organization was immediate and loud. Men who had been raised on codes that measured respect in returns called him reckless. "We are not knights," a lieutenant said, lips pressed thin. We cannot bleed for civics and expect not to be attacked. Matteo understood their fear. He also knew that fear could become its own justification for cruelty. He listened to reports of digital probes, of threats typed fast and venomous into anonymous forums, and understood that symbols could evoke violence as efficiently as bullets. The scholarship was a promise, yes, but promises attract those who would profit by breaking them. Elena found allies too. Parents whose children had been saved by reading circles came forward. An elderly librarian donated a crate of books. Students scribbled notes of thanks that were messy with emotion. Yet resistance hardened like brick. Mr. Alvarez's followers sharpened their words into a campaign that claimed Elena had misplaced priorities and that the Vercelli money would bring influence and strings. The town began to argue about her in ways that made her stomach churn, about the right to educate, about whose values belonged in the classroom, about what a teacher could or could not be. Pressure mounted in subtler ways. Vendors that supplied the school were contacted by accounts that hinted withdrawal of contracts if the scholarship continued. A grant application the school had been counting on, mundane municipal support for science labs, was delayed indefinitely. Elena watched the ripple with the helplessness of a woman learning how stones travel in ponds. Every act of generosity seemed to be countered by another ledger entry that subtracted. She found herself in meetings with the principal and the school board, hearing phrases meant to sound reasonable, risk assessment, public perception, that felt to her like polite euthanasia. On the third week after the donation, a different kind of threat knocked on the school's virtual door. A false allegation posted under a dozen fake names that she had been instructing students to write subversive manifestos. The post blew up. Parents called. A few withdrew their children pending inquiry. Elena stood in the hallway outside her classroom and watched students come and go, their faces a parade of uncertainty. A boy named Jorge, who had been the star of her after-school workshop 2 years ago, lingered by the door. He was usually loud and ready to banter, but now his jaw worked like he was rehearsing silence. Elena took him aside and found him trembling. "Miss Marquez," he whispered, eyes wide, "my aunt says I can't come anymore. She got a message that the scholarship is—" He stopped, searching for a word that would not crush his small courage. Tainted. Tainted. The word landed like a stone. Elena wanted to kneel and scoop him up the way mothers scoop away scrape and rain. Instead, she asked him to write a poem, anything, and he did with the shaky hands of someone trying to hold his future. The poem was about a street lamp and a mother who worked 2 jobs, and a boy who learned that words could make the dark smaller. Elena pinned it to the classroom wall like a soft banner. Matteo watched the backlash like a man watching ice underfoot. He had expected friction. He had not expected the agile cruelty of the digital age. His private counsel proposed measures: legal intimidation to force neutral reporting, cyber troops to flood their accusers with counter-narratives. They wanted to fight fire with a sophistication of flames. Matteo hesitated. He had given money to a teacher, not a platform. He read the poem Jorge wrote in a forwarded message, a child's honest work, and felt the old ache that had come when he found Elena humiliated and alone. He understood that responding with force would turn the symbol into himself, and he had tried to avoid that. Yet passivity risked letting a small town break a life under the guise of civic debate. He authorized a restrained defense, cybersecurity patches for the school servers, an investigation into the fake accounts, discreet pressure on vendors threatening to pull support. His people moved with efficiency. The hackers he used were not the bloodthirsty variety his enemies feared. They were technicians who could reroute an assault and trace an IP. Still, someone left a message on Elena's answering machine, a voice altered, low, and threatening, telling her to stop taking those people's money or else. The "or else" was a cipher she knew too well from a boyhood memory of whispered threats in alleys. The call slid under her skin and settled there like grit. The next week, the school server failed entirely. Student records flickered in and out. For a full day, attendance could not be logged, grades disappeared, and parents' anxieties rose like tides. The principal called an emergency meeting. Inside the fluorescent glow of the library that smelled of ink and binding glue, the board paced in quiet agitation. Elena sat, hands folded, trying to be small enough that the storm would miss her students. At the end of the meeting, a father from a vocational family stood and said plainly, "If this keeps up, we're taking our kids out." The words were a rope thrown over her throat. She called Miguel's name and let it sit in the air like a prayer. She had not spoken it aloud in years. It tasted like iron and memory. What if he had ended up in the hands of men who trafficked in disappearances? What if the Vercelli's world and her brother's vanishing were part of the same ledger? She did not have the right to make demands of Mateo, but she had a right to the truth for herself, if not for the town. Yet truth could be dangerous. It could open doors that could not be closed. Mateo felt the pressure in the rhythm of his days, the not quiet conversations in parking garages, the men who thought charity a kind of weakness. He also felt something else, a subtle pull toward Elena that was not only about the scholarship, but about recognition. He began to visit the town more often than he intended, anonymously, in a hat pulled low, spending time at the cafe where the barista knew how he liked his coffee and let him watch the children in the park. He told his aides to keep the protection subtle, to avoid the obvious armored cars and the men in black. He wanted the town to be saved without feeling dominated. But safety without accountability can be a cage. Elena wanted neither to be a symbolic beneficiary nor a marionette. She agreed to meet someone who represented the foundation, a woman named Lucia who had a temperate voice and a resume thick with nonprofit experience. When Lucia arrived, she sat across from Elena in the small office off the library, folding a napkin into geometric triangles like a nervous habit. "We didn't want to make you public," Lucia said, eyes honest. "The foundation thought anonymity would keep things clean. Mateo insisted on the endowment, but he also wanted to ensure the program wouldn't be used as leverage. He doesn't want you to be paraded." Elena looked at Lucia and saw only a reflection of the mess she had been drawn into. "I don't want to be paraded," she said. "I want my students safe, and I want them to be free to read without politics in their mouths." Lucia smiled sadly. "He knows that. He asked us to offer protective measures for the school and also to ask if you would be willing, at some point, to speak about why arts are important. We're not asking you to be a mouthpiece for him." The caveat landed like a soft reprimand. Elena thought of the answering machine's low voice and thought of George's poem pinned to the wall. "Is he coming to anything?" Elena asked. "Is he—" She did not finish. The question vibrated with the unnameable. Lucia's fingers tightened. "He has his own reasons. He will not make a spectacle. But he wants to make sure the program lasts." Mateo's reasons were a tangle of memory and strategy. He wrote up contingencies with his operations precision, extra layers of encryption for the school's files, legal counsel on retention strategies, an undercover watcher who would sit in the back of Elena's class to ensure no one crossed a line into dangerous territory. He asked that the watcher be as unobtrusive as possible, someone who would be there solely to deter harm. He told his people that he wanted the watcher's report to be a protection, not an invasion. When the watcher was assigned, it was a young woman named Rosa who liked to take notes in Sharpies and laugh at the absurdities of suburban drama. She sat in the back of Elena's classroom for a week and then began to volunteer at the library, shelving books with a blunt but careful grace that made the students accept her as part of the scenery. She never spoke of Matteo unless forced, and when she did, she said only that the foundation wanted what the school wanted, children who could think. Gradually, some of the storm lessened. The cyber intrusion slowed as Matteo's technicians traced and shut down several attack nodes. The fake accounts were flagged and removed. Parents returned, one by one, their faces softened by the work of weeks and the quiet charm of a teacher who refused to be small. Still, a different strain of unease endured, the sense that the school was no longer only a place for learning, but a chessboard where other people's pieces moved. Elena felt like a rook moved for someone else's strategy. Late one evening, a student named Lucia, no relation to the foundation representative, knocked on Elena's door. She held a takeout container and a frightened, defiant look. "My dad says he doesn't want me in your class because it's soft," she said, voice high and brittle. "But I like writing. He says I'm wasting my time." Elena took the container and led Lucia inside, got out 2 chipped bowls, and sat down at her table like the 2 women were making a small, solemn pact. "You are not wasting your time," Elena said. "There is a way to live where you make things that mean something. Trade isn't bad, but you don't have to choose one over the other. Sometimes we make a life from both." Lucia dug into her food, and for a moment the world narrowed to their small table, the hum of the laundromat below, and the feel of a warm bowl in hands that wanted to believe. Elena's chest ached with the knowledge that her choices were being made in public for reasons beyond her control. She wanted to fight for the right to be ordinary in her bravery, to stand in front of a class and teach a boy to hear a line of verse like a key. Matteo watched these human details like a man who had been given access to a rare archive. He found himself returning to them. What a poem made a person do, how a child's faith in language could rearrange a life. He also saw the costs, the way men's anger at the donation had been weaponized, the way a scholarship had become a breach in the town's bloodline. He had placed a gift on a doorstep and in doing so had offered protection that came with the shadowy scent of obligation. He now had to decide whether to go further, to step from behind his ledgers and speak, to place himself in public and risk what his enemies might do. The ledger in his mind balanced in an uneasy tilt. One night, after a day of small victories and fresh fractures, Elena found herself standing at her window watching a shadow move across the street. She couldn't tell if it was a delivery man, a neighbor, or something else. Her phone vibrated, an encrypted message with nothing but one line. "We will keep a light on." It was unsigned. She looked down at the scholarship documents on her table and at Jorge's poem still pinned to the wall. She folded the poem with the care one would fold a fragile map, and in the pocket of the paper she slid the embossed corner of the V. She didn't know if she was cradling a gift or a trap. She only knew she couldn't throw either away. The town was changing, been changed by a single ribbon, and no one could say yet what that change would look like when it finally set. The town held its breath like an animal waiting in winter. In the days that followed, the fractures widened with a cruel deliberateness that made Elena feel she was watching her life become a photograph scorched at the edges. It began with small betrayals. A parent who once volunteered in the library now declined to recommend the school to a neighbor. A former colleague who had once whispered comfort over conference room tea now said the foundation's name with a smirk. Then it escalated to the kind of cruelty that hid in bureaucracy. Grant committees that required onerous new documentation. A zoning inspector who suddenly found 100 tiny infractions on the school's file. It was as if a dozen small hands had been taught to pinch, and each pinch accumulated into bruise. Matteo watched the slow erosion like a man tracing the map of a sabotage he had not invited. He had expected threats. He ran his life through scenarios every night. But this siege worked with the patience of rot. His people traced patterns, found the lawyers who counseled vendors to pull out, mapped the slackening of civic bonds. They found, too, a strand that led back to rival houses who had been nudged by pride and profit to make his generosity a liability. He felt the old fires of family honor flare in those rooms where men spoke of leverage and dominion. They saw his action as a breach because generosity confused their arithmetic. Inside the school, Elena became the axis around which whispered theories rotated. Some called her brave, some called her foolish. The board suggested she curtail the new workshop hours to reduce political exposure. Parents asked her pointed questions at pickup disguised as casual conversation. "Are you comfortable with the attention?" one asked. Though meant as a kindness, it scraped like sandpaper. She found herself answering with teacherly steadiness, "I am comfortable with the work," and then correcting herself, adding that she was not comfortable with being a spectacle. At home, sleep was a flammable commodity. She dreamed of standing in the gym with Alvarez's words like acid raining down. She dreamed of Miguel in a dry warehouse, his hands tied but his mouth clear, with a laugh that cut through concrete. She woke with the taste of dust and a nearly physical ache for him. The scholarship's legal papers were now under the principal's lock, but Elena wanted more than sealed documents. She wanted proof. Proof that her brother had not been an accidental ledger entry in some old family rivalry. Curiosity and dread braided into a tight rope she could not let go of. Mateo, watching from his fortress of screens, began to wonder how much of the town's hostility came not from him, but from who he was to those men. An heir who had sometimes been softer than the family code allowed. He had broken a quiet rule by buying what could not be bought, the right for children to feel. The men in his inner circle called it naivete, and with a bluntness he had learned to hide from compassion, Mateo answered, "And what if naivete is simply another kind of strategy?" They laughed, not kindly. One of them said quietly, "Then be ready to defend it." Defense sharpened quickly into operations. Legal teams, PR councils, a counter-campaign to expose the fake accounts. Even so, Elena felt the creeping moral cost. The town's news feeds were no longer about bake sales or lost dogs, but about donor intent and hidden patronage. The kids in her class felt it too. A couple of them began to ask pointed questions about whether their futures would be entangled with those who could write checks, whether their choices now would be annotated in a ledger. Art does not have to be expensive to be necessary. It is free in the sense that it enters without asking for a signature. But secrets have a way of arriving like winter, inevitable and cold. And so the one that had hovered like a rumor in Elena's family, Miguel's disappearance, moved from a closed drawer into a page that crackled under a bright light. A young investigative journalist who had been digging at the edges of the Vercelli donation for a week called Elena with a voice that trembled with the kind of professional excitement that can be cruel. "Miss Marquez, do you remember a man named Miguel Marquez?" she asked. Elena's phone blurred with sweat. The journalist's tone changed, becoming gentler, as if she had touched a bruise. "We found something," she said, "a ledger. It mentions a transaction around the time your brother disappeared, payments, disappearance fees, a note that reads, 'Settled.'" The world narrowed to a point beneath Elena's feet. A ledger, the coldest possible document, mentioned Miguel. Her breath went mechanical. "Who has it?" she demanded, the teacher in her voice replaced by something sharper, raw. "Where did you find it?" "In a file seized during a raid on a laundering network," the journalist said. "A number connected back to a shell corporation with ties to houses that had cross-border interest with Vercelli family businesses." The name lodged in Elena's throat like a stone. She had never allowed herself to believe that the Vercellis, who moved through the world with clean suits and calibrated ruthlessness, could be connected to the hollow space where her brother's laughter used to live. It was preposterous and yet smelled of truth. She walked the rooms of her apartment like someone trying to avoid places of memory. Books sat on her shelf like islands of a life she was trying not to lose. Mateo received a ping that felt like a clenched fist. One of his analysts had flagged a document, an old contract traced to a third-party firm in Eastern Europe that, in turn, linked to a transaction that had been disguised cleverly, then not so cleverly. A payment labeled for asset recovery and a date 2 days after Miguel's disappearance. He did what men of his world did when a thread connected his name to a wound. He convened a room, and in that room the air tasted of metal. "Find every possible truth," he ordered, controlling his tone so his voice did not betray how his hands were trembling. "No cover-ups. I want the ledger flipped inside out." Outside, the rivals who had weaponized the donation sensed a new opportunity. If Mateo's house might be implicated, even peripherally, in a disappearance, the public's outrage could be redirected into a vendetta that would make Elena's scholarship look like the spearhead of influence. They began to leak hints to bloggers, to pundits inclined to scandal, to people who loved the dull explosion of quasi-justice. Mateo's people pushed back with legal notices and traced the sources, but the leak's damage did not wait to be sealed. Elena did not know whether to breathe or to strike. She called Lucia, who came to her apartment in a raincoat with wet hair and steady hands. "You should not be alone," Lucia said. "This touches on things we try to keep from the public eye. Mateo is not always a neat answer." "Is he involved?" Elena whispered. The question was less about guilt and more about whether the hand that had placed a ribbon on her doorstep had also signed off on her brother's silence. Lucia's face, which rarely betrayed much, looked softer than it had any right to be. "There are ties," she said, "but human ties are messy. The ledger mentions a subcontractor that interfaced with many families. That doesn't mean Mateo knew the name Miguel. It means that someplace in a network of transactions, many of which were predatory, money moved, and someone's absence was accounted for." The words offered no solace. Elena felt the whole of her life, her small acts of faith, her nights with students, the poem Jorge had written, compressed into a single frame where she had to decide: accept help from a man who might be connected to the worst thing that had ever happened to her family, or reject the help and watch the arts program collapse along with the fragile hope it fostered in her students. She no longer trusted gratitude as a pure thing. Gratitude was braided with complicity, and she found herself measuring each sentence she had once said aloud with a new suspicion. What would it mean to sue, to demand a public accounting? What would happen to the kids if the Vercelli money was pulled? Who would fill the vacuum? The ledger's mention of Miguel cracked something in her that had been brittle but intact for years. She remembered the way his hands had worked with a compass and wire, how he had coaxed music out of dead radios. To think that his departure could be logged like a line item, settled, was more than a crime. It was a desecration. Mateos's decisions now were not only strategic, but moral in a new sense. If the ledger traced back to a firm that had done business with his family's operations, it did not automatically indict him. He had, after all, been trying to use his resources to keep a school alive. But the ledger's presence meant that Elena's life and Miguel's absence were entangled in an ugly knot. He understood that any attempt to protect Elena by obscuring connections would offend the one person whose forgiveness he might desire, the woman whose dignity he had tried to restore. The fractures widened at home. Elena found herself lacing her fingers around small certainties: Jorge's poem, the chipped mug she used for morning tea, a sweater Miguel had left behind folded in the back of her closet. Each object was now freighted with accusation and love. She wanted to ask Mateo to tell the truth, but he was not a man she'd seen without a careful masking of motive. To ask him for confession was to enter someone else's private warfare. Then, in a late-night conversation filtered through reluctant phone calls and a city of half-truths, Matteo offered an impossible thing: transparency. He would open channels where his firm's subcontractors could be audited. He would hand over files that might clear a path or at least show how tangled their footings were. He did not come to her with a press conference or a dramatic reveal. He sent a secure message: "I will help you find him." Not "I might," not "we could," but "I will help you find him." The sentence landed like a rope thrown into a ravine. It was not a confession of guilt, and it was not absolution. It was a promise, flawed and human. For the first time, Elena felt something shift into motion that could be neither purchased nor dismissed. An entanglement formed, not by transaction, but by pursuit. She also heard, underneath the promise, the gentle warning of danger. To look for the truth would invite the town's wolves to the hunt. They agreed, without ceremony, to begin. Matteo would use what he could to open files and trace the ledger's arc. Elena would give him the names, the dates, the small memories that could act as keys. They would do this not as donor and recipient, but as two people tethered now by a common aim: to find Miguel, to know the truth, and to decide what justice should look like when it arrived. The decision itself felt like the breaking of something old, an old way of keeping wounds private, and the making of something new, dangerous and raw. Outside, the town's lights burned on, unaware that two lives were beginning to converge around a ledger and a poem. Inside Elena's living room, she slid Miguel's sweater back into the closet, and then, as if sealing an oath, took the scholarship letter from the table and placed it into a drawer beside it. She did not yet know whether she had surrendered to the Vercella's shadow or partnered with a man who sought atonement. All she knew was that secrets had surfaced and fractures had shown the raw architecture beneath. And somewhere beyond the window, Matteo watched his city with a decision tightening inside him like a fist. He would not let a light he had kindled go out without laying his own hands bare to the flames that might consume him. They agreed then, in the dull silver of midnight messages and the brittle shiplight of anxious sleep. Matteo would open what doors he could, and Elena would hand him every small thing she had saved in boxes and memory. The pact was awkward, made of necessity and impatience, a contract without paper. It felt to Elena like stepping into a river whose current she could not fully read. It felt to Matteo like walking into a room where every window might shatter. Both understood that this pursuit could close chapters or open graves. Matteo began by ordering a quiet excavation. He summoned analysts who specialized in bones of transactions, men and women who could follow a payment through 100 shells until the money arrived at its final shameful destination. They worked like surgeons, precise and unromantic, and within 48 hours they produced a map that showed transfers, intermediaries, and the odd pattern that suggested someone had tried very deliberately to mask a particular disappearance. There was a name, too, an intermediary company that had received funds labeled in innocuous legalese: asset recovery, logistics, settlement services. The dates trembled. The confirmation had cleared 2 days after Miguel vanished. Elena held the document with a hand that shook. The paper felt like a verdict in a language she had never wanted to learn. "Is there," she breathed, unable to ask the question that wanted to leap from her throat. "Is this—" Matteo did not answer immediately. He had learned to keep his face even in rooms where decisions were lethal. "We can trace the ownership," he said finally. "We can subpoena, but there will be noise. If those men know someone is following, they will bury the ledger deeper, or they will burn what connects them." He looked at Elena, and for once there was no armor in his eyes, only a tired man who had set his hand to a task that might cost him more than his comfort. If you want the truth, be prepared for the truth to hurt. Elena had waited years for the truth to hurt. Waiting had taught her a brittle courage. "I want to know," she said, "even if it is ugly." The words landed like stepping stones. She was not naive enough to think the path would be clean. They moved next with a deliberate slowness, because haste would be their enemy. Mateo's legal team filed requests through channels that were public and through channels that were not. He sanctioned protective measures for Elena that were visible and simple. An extra lock, a silent alarm linked to a civilian hotline, but also measures that lived in the gray between law and necessity. A discreet watcher who would sit in the library. A driver who suddenly took different routes. Elena hated the idea of being guarded. She hated that a child's safety had been rerouted through a man's resources. Yet she also knew the price of refusing shelter when a storm promised lightning. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A hairline error in a launderer's ledger whose staffer had been careless, copying an invoice number into a memo field. That mistake yielded an IP address and a shell of correspondence that pointed not to Mateo directly, but to a broker who had worked with many houses. The broker's trail ran cold in one city and hot in another. Mateo's team closed in on a warehouse whose manifests included radios repaired in a batch around the time Miguel disappeared. Mundane items, the sort of goods that formed the backbone of small trades. A photograph of the warehouse's loading dock showed a lanky young man working with his sleeves rolled, a silhouette Elena thought she recognized. She did. The proof arrived like a tidal wave in a shallow bay. Mateo produced, with all the reluctance of a man bearing both a gift and a knife, a surveillance still taken from a courier's dashcam. Miguel, older by 5 years but unmistakable, leaning over a bench, his fingers stained with solder. The image made Elena's breath stop. A dozen living things quieted as if the world had been asked to listen. She put her hand to her mouth and tasted the old music of him. Laughter at midnight, the warmth of his grin, and the memory was so sharp. "How?" she started. The question dissolved. Mateo's face was blank, a map of containment. "Found in a cache associated with a subcontractor," he said. "They did repairs and transport for various clients. They were hired to reclaim certain assets. We traced Miguel by the benchmarkings and a note he had scribbled on an invoice. He wasn't cataloged as an asset, he was used as labor. He was alive then when they left that manifest. After that," his voice tightened, "the trail went cold." Cold was a word Elena had lived with for years. The photograph was both balm and blade. Proof that her brother had been within reach of other men. Proof that dispassionate ledgers had counted a human life as a line item. "We find him," she said simply. There was a teacherly clarity in it, an assignment given and accepted. Mateo moved then with a decisiveness she had come to both fear and admire. He authorized a raid on the warehouse, not with flash and brass like a movie, but with meticulous timing. Men in plain clothes, warrants prepared by lawyers who had long ago learned how to hide justice in paperwork, and a single thread of trust with a detective in the city who owed Mateo a favor he had never named. The raid found little at first beyond scrap metal and a ledger with more half-truths. But in a locked office, behind a false panel, they found a cache of items labeled with names and dates, shipped not to the Vercelli houses, but to smaller, vengeful pockets that traded in disappearances and repairs. There was a file stamped in the corner with provincial references. It looked bureaucratic, almost humorless in its cruelty. "Get us the province," Mateo ordered. When they arrived in the province, an edge town of warehouses and roads that smelled of diesel and pines, they moved quietly, 2 cars, 2 drivers, faces unmasked. Elena went with them. She had not wanted to be protected in spectacle, she wanted to be part of the pursuit, to hold her own compass. The men at headquarters tried to dissuade her. Mateo's chief insisted she stay. Elena listened and chose. The provincial safe house was small. Inside, under a fluorescent light that buzzed like a nervous insect, Mateo's men found a room of boxes that contained photos, ledgers, and a series of invoices that finally named a client. A shell corporation tied, faintly, so faintly that a false narrative could have wiped it, back to a man named V. The name alone cracked open a chorus of whispers, but Mateo's analysts had already cut through rumor with the cold blade of correlation. The payments were not direct. They were laundered through layers designed to protect those who paid, not those who suffered. And yet, there was one file, misfiled by clerks who did not expect anyone to care. A small printout where Miguel had been named in passing as payment reconciled, followed by a terse note, resolved. The single word felt like a verdict that refused to be dignified. Elena clutched it, and for a moment the room swam. She wanted to scream, to tear the whole edifice down with a teacher's fury. Instead, she knelt and pressed both palms to the table as if to steady herself. Resolved, she said aloud, as if the pronunciation might change the fact. Mateo saw the way the word bent her. He also saw, with an ungloved clarity, the cost of letting quiet things pass. He could have ordered the files sealed. He could have protected his house and its reputation by burying the paper. Instead, he did something that cost him more than pride. He took the printout and, with a steadying hand that surprised even him, slid the page into an evidence envelope and signed his name across the flap. The choice cracked the room like a bell. Someone, an operative with a moral code flexible enough to bend, passed the envelope to the provincial detective who had helped, and the detective placed it into a chain of custody that would be visible, sticky with the law's light. Mateo watched as bureaucracy turned their small, shameful ledger into a thing located in the world, accountable to its paper trail. He smelled the cost. His family's pride would be bruised. Enemies would sharpen knives. His men might call him a fool. He also felt, in the chesty hollow where he had stored his private soft edge, a strange relief. Elena, watching him make the signature, felt something inside shift. The man who had left her a ribboned box had just signed a formal acknowledgement that implicated the network whose shadow had swallowed her brother. It was not confession, and it was not forgiveness. It was action. It was, she thought, with a sudden and disorienting clarity, the only language some men of power understood, the public naming of a fact. They were not done. The provincial suit opened a legal process that would not move fast enough to satisfy grief. It would move in a way that required patience and attendance. Mateo vowed to finance the legal campaign, to unspool the network thread by thread, to keep the press at bay until the facts could be made to stand in a line no publicist could shrink. He offered Elena protection that would no longer be an anonymous shadow, but a partnership. He would stand with her in public, not as a benefactor with a hand on her shoulder, but as a man willing to be seen where it mattered. The decision to stand together at the next public meeting was both a risk and a kind of surrender. Elena hesitated, not because she feared his presence, but because she feared what appearing together would mean for the children who came to her classroom for sanctuary. Mateo watched that hesitation and answered with a small, disarming honesty. "You asked me to help find your brother," he said. "I will not use my name to take your light. I will only step whenever you ask me to step." She believed him then, not because his words were expensive, but because his actions had matched them. When they stepped into the town square for the press, it was not the tableau Mateo's strategists would have designed. He stood beside Elena without taking up the space he could have owned. He answered halting questions with truths that did not aim to flatter. He did not speak of redemption or atonement. He spoke of complicity and of things that needed to be seen and named. Elena watched the faces in the crowd, some skeptical, some hopeful, and felt for the first time since the ribbon that she could be present without being consumed. The raid's aftermath, the signed documents, and the public presence reframed the story. Rivals barked in private, yes. There were threats that cut like small knives. But something else happened too. A shift in the town's gravity. People who had been quiet found courage. The librarian, who had once donated a box of books, testified about students who had changed because of Elena's classes. Parents who had pulled their children back sent notes apologizing. Small acts aggregated into a new pressure that moved the legal machinery with a force of its own. In the weeks that followed, Matteo continued to open files and Elena continued to give him the names that meant the most to her, the small specifics no ledger could quantify. They found more misfiled documents, a courier who remembered a payment, a taxi driver who could place a van in front of a warehouse on the night Miguel disappeared. Each discovery came with danger and the taste of victory. A person had been accounted for, and now the accounting could be challenged. The climax of this act came on a rainless afternoon when the provincial detective, now committed in a way that felt human rather than administrative, presented a warrant that would allow them to search a property tied directly to one of the broker companies. The search turned up a room of men who had thought themselves invisible and ledgers that finally named more than initials. It led, after a day that felt like a year, to a living room in a tucked-away town where an older man sat across from a woman who had the same jaw Elena remembered in Miguel. The detectives moved with the quiet force of law. Miguel, when they found him, was bruised and thin and highly alive to the relief of everyone in the room. The reunion was not cinematic. Miguel did not leap into Elena's arms with tears. He simply looked at her, the way a man does when he has been given back a map to a country he thought he'd lost. He sat, and she sat beside him, and the two of them held hands like people reconciling with time. Matteo watched from the doorway, anonymous no longer, his suit a neutral gray. He let himself stand in the room and watch those small human motions without taking credit. He had not bought their repair. He had only shored open a path to it. That, he now understood, was the truest way to use power. There was a cost. The leaked documents and the raid set off a chain reaction in Matteo's world. Allies turned cold, enemies sharpened their tongues, and old men in suits wondered if the softness Matteo had displayed would be the undoing of their house. He felt the weight of their scorn like a physical pressure. He had traded safety for truth, and the ledger that had once functioned like armor had become, for him, an open wound. But he had a sight no ledger could buy, the sight of a woman who would no longer let herself be small, and the quiet return of a brother who had once been catalogued as resolved. That evening, Elena walked home with Miguel at her side, fingers interlaced with the easy dependence of siblings returning from a long exile. The town watched them with a kind of reverent curiosity. The laundromat's lights shone, and kids on the sidewalk stared as if at a small miracle. Matteo watched from across the street, anonymous in a coat, and for a moment he allowed himself to feel the warmth of having done something that mattered. He had not undone all the harm his world had wrought. He had not absolved himself, but the man who had left a box with a ribbon had become a man who would stand in the daylight and bear the consequences of that act. Redemption, they both learned, was less a clean clearing than a series of actions that required continued courage. Reclaiming a life had been a joint labor involving legal filings, late-night searches, and a moral reckoning neither had wanted but both needed. The town would not forget easily, nor would it forgive quickly. But in the small classroom where Jorge read a poem aloud the next day with a fierceness that made several adults cry, the light felt different, not because it was brighter, but because it was no longer afraid to be seen. Elena walked into the classroom the next morning with Miguel beside her, both carrying the small hush of something reclaimed. Students noticed before the staff, a tremor of relief that made pens pause. Jorge read his poem louder than before, and the room breathed. The scholarship remained in effect. The workshops continued, but their meaning had shifted. Money no longer felt like a silencing bell, but a fragile scaffold. Elena kept her distance from headlines, refusing to become a symbol, while Matteo accepted consequence with a surprising humility. He answered questions when he had to, and otherwise stood against margins that could not be softened. Some members of his circle called him foolish, others called him necessary. Elena learned to ask for boundaries, transparency about funds, clear limits on presence, and a promise that her classroom would not become a foothold in any broader game. Matteo agreed, and so they drew lines together, awkwardly and honestly. The legal proceedings continued, slow and noisy, with deposits of truth and cost. Some allies distanced themselves, some allies returned, ashamed and steady. Elena and Miguel walked home one evening beneath street lamps that made their breath visible, small and human. They stopped at the laundromat window, and Miguel pointed to a neighbor's child drawing stars. He smiled in a way Elena had missed, and the town watched that ordinary intimacy as if it were a miracle. Matteo kept his distance, but came sometimes to leave unmarked books at the library, titles that matched classroom needs. Children found them and whispered thanks without knowing why. The final reckoning was moral more than legal. The town had to admit that a life was not a ledger entry, that kindness could be complicated, and that courage might come in unexpectedly shaped hands. On a quiet afternoon, Elena closed her classroom door and stood at the window, watching children bike past. She pulled Miguel's sweater from the drawer, breathed it in, and then folded it into the top of her closet. She left the scholarship letter on her desk, no longer afraid of its paperweight. Outside, Matteo walked past the school gate and looked up at a classroom window where a small poem taped to glass fluttered. He did not knock. He had learned that some help is best given from the margin. Elena watched him go and felt neither ownership nor indebtedness, but a simple permission.